Good afternoon by 2 minutes. Uh, Welcome to the Heritage Foundation. My name is David Burton. I'm Senior Fellow in Economic Policy here at the Heritage Foundation. And today we're having an event discussing FINRA, the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. Our event today is going to take the form of an interview with Robert Cook, who is CEO of FINRA. We're going to have a discussion, and after a little while of Robert and I talking about FINRA and developments there, we're going to have you, the audience, become part of the discussion. Now, let me just take a minute or two to discuss or frame our discussion and then introduce Robert. FINRA is a regulator of central importance, although it's not widely understood and a lot of people don't know a lot of things about FINRA. It is commonly called a self-regulatory organization, or SRO. It's a Delaware not-for-profit corporation. It is not a government agency, yet it is important in terms of its size and scope. It has a budget of approximately $1 billion, which compares to the SEC's budget of $1.6 billion. It has approximately, 3,500 employees compared to the SEC's 4,300. So its budget is about 2/3 that of the SEC, and its employee count is approximately 80%. It regulates broker-dealers and has a strong role in the regulation of stock exchanges. It was originally formed when the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ became private for-profit stock exchanges rather than member-owned or mutual exchanges, and the regulatory functions of those two exchanges were merged, and that became FINRA. It plays an important role in terms of disciplining bad actors in the broker-dealer community. It imposes fines. You can bar broker-dealers from the industry or individuals from participating in his industry. Robert Cook became CEO a little over a year ago. He has, in my judgment, done the right things. He undertook a listening tour all over the country with all different kinds of constituencies. And many times he went without an entourage, unlike a lot of people in his position, so that he could get frank and honest input from people without having to worry how that might be taken back in FINRA among the staff. He also has launched a program that we're going to talk about a fair amount today called FINRA 360, which is meant to be a comprehensive review of FINRA, what it does, and how it might be reformed. Now, I suppose it's no secret that I believe that some reforms are appropriate at FINRA. And I don't want to put words in Robert's mouth, but it seems to me that his listening tour and undertaking FINRA 360 shows that he believes there's at least some room for improvement there as well. I also think there's a renewed or new interest in FINRA. The SEC has recently stood up a new office to engage in FINRA and other SRO oversight. The House Financial Services Committee last month held the first oversight hearing with respect to FINRA in a very long time. And just today, the Treasury Department released a report, which I recommend you look at, which discusses SROs, including FINRA, and specifically calls out FINRA for praise in terms of its FINRA 360 initiative. Now, allow me to introduce our guest. Robert Cook is the president and CEO of FINRA, a position he assumed about 14 months ago. He's also chairman of the FINRA Investor Education Foundation. He had previously served from 2010 to 2013 as the head of the Division of Trading and Markets at the SEC. The division is responsible for a wide variety of things, including the oversight of broker-dealers. Prior to his service at the SEC and now at FINRA, both in between the SEC and FINRA and before, he was a partner at Cleary, Gottlieb, Steen, and Hamilton. And during his private practice, he focused extensively on broker-dealer or regulation. He has a JD from Harvard and an undergraduate degree from Harvard, and also a master's from the London School of Economics. We are going to cover a lot of ground and discuss a lot of complex issues. So with that, let's get started. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation. I first wanted to ask you a question about how's the job, and is there anything that you found surprising or was different than you anticipated?
Well, first let me start by thanking you, David, for the opportunity to be here, and thank you to the Heritage Foundation for hosting this event, and thanks to all of you for coming and for your interest in FINRA, and I look forward to later in the program having an opportunity to address your questions. I've been in the job about 14 months, as you said. It's been a wonderful learning experience for me to learn more about FINRA. But I think one of the things that has been especially interesting for me has been, as you mentioned, the listening tour, to learn a lot about our stakeholders, our members in particular, hear their thoughts about FINRA, which I know we'll be talking more about as we proceed, and to hear their support in many ways for self-regulation and for the model of self-regulation and interest in engaging with us as we pursue the FINRA 360 initiative.
Okay. Well, as I mentioned to you a little bit before we started, we have different levels of understanding of FINRA in our audience, both here and on the web. So let's start with the basic question. What is FINRA and what does it do?
Well, FINRA, you could think of it as the frontline regulator for the brokerage industry. There are about 3,800 firms, about 630,000 registered reps, and FINRA is the primary SRO, or self-regulatory organization, supervising those firms. So what does that mean? What do we do? Well, anybody who wants to be in the brokerage industry as a firm has to become a member of FINRA. They have to apply and then get registered with FINRA. FINRA administers testing requirements and continuing education requirements for individual brokers. And then once they're a member of FINRA, they need to comply with our rules that we write and that are adopted pursuant to SEC approvals. We conduct examinations, thousands of examinations every year to make sure firms are complying with the rules and the SEC's rules. And we also then bring enforcement proceedings where that's appropriate. So oversight of the brokerage industry is our primary function. We also, as you mentioned, have a role to play in the oversight of the trading in the securities markets. Through contracts with the exchanges, we pull in data of about 99% of the equity trading and about 60 or so percent of options market trading, and we surveil that data to look for anomalies or patterns and pursue those through examination and enforcement proceedings on our own part or on behalf of the securities exchanges as appropriate. We also operate certain utilities in the market. So for example, we operate some trade reporting facilities. One that you may have heard of is Trace, which is a trade reporting facility for fixed income instruments. And that was recently expanded to cover Treasury instruments just this last July. So now for the first time, we have reporting for regulatory purposes of all transactions in Treasury securities, which is the deepest and most liquid market in the world. So it's a great advance for, I think, for our markets. So we operate utilities like that. We provide our members with compliance tools to help them comply with the rules, whether it's education or compliance templates or report cards or other things that give them information that will help them comply with the rules. And another important function that we perform is education of investors. And since this is World Investor Week, I'd be remiss if I didn't make a plug for investor education. We, together with the SEC and the CFTC and the state regulators, issued an alert this week, which is available on our website or the SEC's website, investor.gov. And I encourage you to take a look at that and share that with anyone you know who might be interested in investing as part of the educational efforts for this week.
So, again, along the lines of explaining FINRA and what it does, when if you're an investor and you have a complaint or a concern about a broker-dealer, how would you interact with FINRA? How would you seek to work with FINRA to resolve the problem?
So there are a couple of ways. You might, we have a tips and complaints line, so you might call that up and share your concerns, and then we would follow up on that. We have a whistleblower line, so that if you see concerns about what's happening in industry, we have people who then follow up on those kinds of tips. We have sometimes help desks. We have certain help desks that we have. So, for example, we offer a helpline for senior investors or people who care for senior investors. We started this about 2.5 years ago. It's run out of our Boca Raton office, and it's been a tremendous success in getting calls from every state in the country, from people age 17 to 102, calling up with questions of all kinds of things. And the goal of the helpline is to provide a supportive environment for people who have basic questions or concerns about their broker that they'd like to follow up on, and we assist them as appropriate. If there's something that indicates a fraud, or we will either pursue it ourselves or refer it to the appropriate state regulators or to the SEC. If it's just an area of confusion, we can help with that too. So that's another way that investors often interact with FINRA.
Now, in some sense, you're a cop for the broker-dealer industry. What tools are in your toolbox in terms of working with broker-dealers, either educationally or in terms of sanctions or fines, and just help people understand how you help enforce the rules?
Sure. So as I mentioned, we conduct examinations of broker-dealers and registered representatives. And lately we've had a particular focus on what we call high-risk brokers or high-risk firms to really try to identify bad actors in the industry. And you asked earlier about, what are things that I've experienced in the first year. In my listening tour, one of the things I was particularly interested in, surprised by in some ways, but pleased by, was the level of interest that this industry has in maintaining high standards in the industry, and a lot of support for us as a regulator targeting bad actors who give the rest of the industry a bad name. So we do that through examination programs, and then if we see something that we believe is a problem, if we have jurisdiction, we can pursue that through an enforcement mechanism. And if we don't have jurisdiction, we can make a referral to the SEC, and we make hundreds of referrals to the SEC every year. The enforcement proceeding mechanism would be we conduct investigation, and if it's contested, there would be a hearing where both sides get to our enforcement department, and the firm or individual can present their sides to a hearing panel, which then writes a decision. And these are public decisions, you can read them. That can be appealed to an appellate panel that we have, and then from there it can be appealed to the SEC, and then up to the federal courts. So there's a disciplinary process we have that involves many of the types of things you would expect to see in a disciplinary proceeding: opportunities to appear, present your case, and then to appeal to a higher
And if there's
court.
an adverse finding, you can either impose a fine or bar an individual or firm in principle from the industry by revoking their license, right?
Yeah, so the hearing panel would decide what the appropriate penalty would be. Obviously, FINRA's enforcement staff would have a proposal. But yes, the consequences could then be either imposing a fine, a suspension from the industry, or a bar from the industry.
Okay.
And you mentioned before, we're a self-regulatory organization. One of the ways that the industry is part of our governance is that on that hearing panel, there are 2 industry representatives and 1 professional hearing officer who hear the first level of hearings. And then if there's an appeal from that up to what we call our National Adjudicatory Council, there are industry representatives on that. And that council issues a decision, either supporting the hearing panel or maybe amending their decision. And if there's a dispute over whether someone wants to pursue that decision, then they can appeal it to the SEC. So there's multiple layers of appeal process.
All right, let's talk about self-regulatory organizations. FINRA is, at least in principle, a self-regulatory organization. We'll talk about your governance structure in a minute. And there are some people who don't think a regulator should be an SRO, or at least queasy about it. And think that the regulatory function should be in government. There are others who argue that self-regulatory organizations are better in a number of important respects. Could you talk a little bit about why you think an SRO is preferable, and your experience perhaps with an SRO? You've been in government and an SRO, and why you think that the SRO structure makes sense.
Sure. So the SRO structure, just to give a little background, came out of the securities laws. So it's really operates under statute from as adopted by Congress, going way back to the Exchange Act of 1934. And there are 33 different SROs in the securities world.
But only one for broker dealers.
There is yes, there are different types, is my
Right.
point. And so sometimes when people talk about SROs and what the issues they present are, it's important to talk about which SRO are we talking about, what type of SRO.
Right.
There are some for-profit SROs, there were a not-for-profit SRO, and I'm not saying one is better or worse, I'm just saying there are different models. And so I think particularly with respect to FINRA as an SRO, the theory going back to the very beginning of this model was that there are certain advantages in this very complex market that can be achieved by leveraging this model rather than just making the government bigger. And it's not even just a size thing. There are certain things that an SRO could do that the government can't do as readily. So what are those things? Well, number one, SROs are really meant to interact closely with the industry to leverage their expertise and their experience in the markets. And the idea is you'd get smarter, more effective, more efficient regulation of these very complex markets if the people who are close to them can play an active role in developing the regulations. Number two, there's no taxpayer dollars at work here. So the industry that's generating the need for the regulation is the one paying for that regulation. And also, because of the funding structure, there's an opportunity to invest in initiatives that may be harder for the government to invest in on a routine basis. So we can make capital investments in technology, for example, that some government agencies have more challenge in getting, going through the budget process. We can make longer term capital investments as well. Another advantage that has been identified with respect to SROs is the ability to operate certain utilities that require a lot of industry expertise and technology, like the TRACE reporting system I mentioned earlier. Another one is the broker check, which is the system where information about your broker or the firm you work with is available for you. So you can go in and see, hey, is the person I'm working with even registered? Because one of the red flags is if you're getting investment advice from someone who's not registered as a broker or an investment advisor. So we can operate utilities like that. Another advantage is that we can provide compliance tools to the regulated entities. So you don't usually think of the government as thinking of part of its job is to provide tools to those that it regulates to help them regulate. But I think that's part of our job, is to help find ways to provide information, resources, tools to the people we regulate to help them comply.
Yeah, I want to get back to that, but one last question, sort of on SROs. I mean, typically when you think of an SRO, you think it's an industry-controlled organization. FINRA, under its governance structure, is not controlled by the industry, although the industry has an important role on its board and obviously in its processes. So, do you think it's fair to say that FINRA is really an SRO in the sense of the industry regulating itself, since the industry doesn't control it, is there any thinking going on about the governance structure one way or another? I would just be interested in your view.
It's a good question. So sometimes people do think SRO means that it's entirely the industry regulating itself. And there needs to be industry involvement for an SRO to achieve the advantages I just talked about. But over time, there's been the model has been reviewed from time to time by Congress, which requires some non-industry, the statute we operate under requires some non-industry membership on our board, and as well as by the SEC. And there's a balance to be struck here, right? Because some people are concerned the industry regulating itself won't be credible.
Right.
And other people are concerned that if there's not enough industry involvement in the regulation, then why not just have the government do it? And so the balance that we are working with here, and I think it's inherent in the model of every SRO, you could call it a conflict, but it's one that is a healthy conflict in a way, I think, is how to make sure there's enough industry involvement in the governance and in the actual activities, and yet make sure that that involvement doesn't lead to results that are not helpful. There have been times in the past where the SEC has stepped in and said, we think you're too, in some aspect, there's been too much industry influence. And that led to results that they thought were not sufficient.
Do you have one in mind?
There was in the 90s, there was a SEC action against NASD/NASDAQ at the time, that there was too much industry involvement in enforcement decisions, for example. And there was a so-called Section 21A report that came out of that. And in many respects, that's why we look like we do in certain ways. So, for example, now the industry does not have involvement in the decision of whether to bring an enforcement action. That's a direct result of the SEC finding that the industry was not acting when it should have. And there are other aspects of it. And I think this is not just with respect to FINRA. Other SROs have evolved over the years so that I think virtually all of them have either 50% public on their board or 51%. And that's a policy decision. And again, we're trying to strike the right balance here between industry involvement and credible investor protection. And the big levers there, on the one hand, industry involvement through representation on our board. We have large firms who are elected to our board, medium-sized representative, and small firms all elected to our board. We have industry committees that help advise FINRA and the board on rules, on programs, active involvement by the industry committees. We have, for example, a small firm advisory board that itself has elected members on it to help advise on the impact of regulation on small firms. I mentioned before that industry serves on some of the hearing panels for disciplinary decisions. So those are examples of bringing industry involvement into the process. On the other side, in this checks and balances approach, we have a board that the majority of which are public governors, not in the brokerage industry. We have close SEC oversight. And you mentioned that in your introductory remarks, that has increased in the last year as a result of some policy decisions that the SEC made, that they were going to allocate more of their resources to the investment advisor space and rely more on FINRA in the brokerage space, but in so doing to increase their oversight of FINRA, which they have.
You mentioned that you regard as part of your mission helping firms achieve compliance, and you also mentioned sort of the tripartite industry representation on the board with small broker-dealers. So I'd like to talk for a second about FINRA and small broker-dealers. I've heard a lot of complaints from small broker-dealers about FINRA, and you've identified through your FINRA 360 process that as a potential issue. And most of the smaller broker-dealers I talk to don't feel like the FINRA staff they interact with is sort of adopting a spirit of trying to achieve compliance, but more along the lines of a government agency seeking enforcement and perhaps fines. So I was wondering, would you agree there's something with respect to small broker-dealers that maybe needs attention? Are you looking at it? Have you learned anything? Have you taken steps to maybe try to change that culture a little bit?
So, small broker-dealers are, in terms of numbers of firms, are 90% of our membership. They are 10% of the registered reps that are out there, so that gives you a sense for the
A registered rep being an individual
the
that works for a
individual, sorry.
broker-dealer.
Yes,
They just,
thank you.
yeah.
Nope, thank you. So 90% of the firms are small broker-dealers, but 90% of the individuals who work at broker-dealers are with
The
10%
big
of
firms,
the
right?
larger firms. Um, but the smaller broker model is one I personally feel adds value to our financial system.
And I think it's also particularly important for the sort of entrepreneurs trying to raise capital.
Right, and I think any conversation about FINRA and small firms, it's really important to start with the statement that they matter, right? It's important for people to understand that I think that they bring value to our system, and that includes that in many cases they provide services to communities or individuals who might otherwise potentially be underserved. They often provide a different set of services than a larger firm might. And many smaller firms actually are very active in the capital raising process. And they know local issuers, they know local municipalities. Who knows the local water board or the local school district better than people who live there? And so it's important that we try to find an environment where
Yeah, the large broker-dealers are located in half a dozen major metropolitan areas, and the small ones are spread throughout the country.
And I think this is one of the things I learned on a listening tour was the heterogeneity in the business models that FINRA represents. So that's part of the challenge is that we have so many different business models. And even in the small firm world, there are different types of businesses. You know, there are fintech startups. There are more traditional retail investment advisors. There are firms that focus primarily on capital raising activities. So different business models. And so we need to figure out a way to try to ensure investor protection across all of these different channels, but in ways that are not overly burdensome. And that's certainly something I'm very interested in pursuing. We've been engaging with our small firm advisory board on their ideas about what to, and part of the listening tour. I've had 12 different roundtables with small firms, all outside of the Beltway, because I feel they're not going to get to visit me.
Is any of that going to result in a report or recommendations that the public will be able to see?
Well, we're as part of the FINRA 360 initiative, which is really taking this.
And that's where I was about to head.
Yeah, taking this feedback that we've gotten from the listening tour and from other sources. We are working through various recommendations that we've gotten, and our goal is to update people periodically on what we've done in response to what we've heard. And so you'll be seeing reports from time to time, but we're really trying to move with a sense of urgency, especially on the small stuff. I mean, there's some big picture things that we've done already, like combining our enforcement programs, which is something we announced. We kind of had 2 enforcement programs that were legacy from the entities that we were merged together to create FINRA. And people sometimes experience that as if there were 2 regulators or there were inconsistent approaches. So we analyzed the issue. We decided we could be more efficient and preserve investor protection by merging those departments. So that's a type of organizational change that will take time to implement, but we've determined to move forward on. We're looking at other changes as well. But in the meantime, there are a lot of more nuts and bolts things that I hear when I'm in the roundtables. And hey, can you make this system work differently?
Let's talk about FINRA 360. And why don't you try to explain what it is, what you're trying to accomplish, but also importantly, the timeline. Is it going to result in reports? Is it going to result in recommendations? Because at some point we need to move past talking about change and actually trying to get some change done.
Well, we have done some changes.
Well, that's true.
We've this merger of the enforcement programs I just mentioned. You can go on our website and you can see a FINRA 360 page, which will give you a list of the things we've done so far. We issued a notice earlier this year on how we engage with the public and through our many advisory committees, how we engage with our membership and other stakeholders. and what types of, about a rulemaking process, about what types of disclosures we make. We've got a lot of healthy feedback from that, and we're working through that with our board. One of the areas where there was interest, for example, was to have more transparency into our board. So we have created a new governance webpage that provides more information about who's on our board, what their backgrounds are, what committees they serve on. We're working to provide more guidance around the committee structure that we have and how you can get involved and what the committees do. But we're also looking at the committee structure itself and moving to having looking at whether there are some committees that we don't have but should have, or that we need to restructure some of the committees. So it's a rolling process, David, where we're trying to get things done rather than wait to the end and do a big bang. And we're periodically, we're constantly updating our webpage when we do something new as part of this FINRA 360 initiative. I think when we get to issues around changes in our governance structure or things like that, we'll take the input we got and we'll either act on it and share that, or we'll talk about with our board about why we wouldn't. You mentioned the Treasury report, and that is called for a review of SROs. And so that only came out this morning, but one of the things we'll be thinking about is how our FINRA 360 can be.
Well, I think you're way ahead of most SROs on that, having initiated this process, what, 7 or 8 months ago now?
Yeah.
Well, let's talk, you mentioned transparency. Let's talk about transparency. I mean, one of the criticisms that a number of people have made, including myself, is that FINRA is not sufficiently transparent. There's a couple of different aspects of that, obviously, and obviously you can't have total transparency with respect to confidential private information and certain other deliberations, just like there isn't at the SEC. On the other hand, you have made some changes in terms of reporting more information about board of directors meetings, but unlike, for example, Securities and Exchange Commission meetings, FINRA board meetings are closed. So it's really you and perhaps the chairman and a couple of key staffers describing what happened in there, and you get no sense of who was saying what the real arguments were, and for or against a particular proposition. There aren't minutes, although now you report sort of some of the actions that were taken. Are you thinking about any additional changes to transparency at the board level, or are you comfortable where you are at this point, or you want to wait and see, or?
Well, as I mentioned, you've identified a couple things we've been trying to work on, which is give more information before the board meeting about what we're going to be talking about, and more depth into our description of what was discussed at the board meeting. And that's a journey. I think there's more work we are and will be doing on that front. There were, in response to this engagement notice, where we really opened ourselves up to the world and says, tell us how you think we should be thinking about our engagement. There were comments about whether we ought to make our board meetings open to the public, and so we will be taking those comments seriously, and that will be a board level decision. It's not going to be a Robert Cook decision. That's going to be something we talk about at the board. I think that the guiding principle that, at least in my view, ought to be taken into account there is, will this help us be a better SRO, be a better self-regulatory organization? I think there are different views on that, right? So some people would say having things open to the public, you see what people are saying, but you're not seeing as much of a candid discussion go on as you would in a private meeting. And so those are the kind of balancing that needs to happen. But I think that if you're to your question about will that be something that's considered, absolutely, because we're going to walk through all the significant governance recommendations with our board to get their views on that.
Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about your arbitration process. I mean, that's a significant part of what you do, and just for the benefit of people, most broker-dealers require their customers to sign an agreement that commits to arbitration. and the arbitration is almost always at FINRA. So customer disputes are resolved by arbitration. So maybe if you could take a minute and describe your arbitration process, and then we'll talk about some of the potential reforms to that process. But it's what, roughly 4,000 arbitrations a year that are conducted or something like
Yeah, we have a lot of information on our dispute resolution program on our website, which I welcome you to look at. We do arbitrations and we do mediations. As you were saying, David, this is a process to resolve disputes between a customer and a broker, whether an individual or firm, or within the industry, between a broker
That's
and
true,
a
yeah.
firm, or between two firms. Now, FINRA does not mandate arbitration to resolve disputes, but it is typically a provision of brokerage contracts that there be arbitration. And in our view, it's the question of whether there should be arbitration or not really has been delegated by Congress to the SEC because they have authority to condition or limit the use of these mandatory arbitration agreements. But so in the world we exist now, there is the most disputes are subject to arbitration. And so FINRA operates a forum that's run pursuant to rules that have been filed with and approved by the SEC after public notice and comment. So it's a rules-based system where the parties can resolve their disputes and without going to court. And as is typical for these arbitration programs, the arbitrators are pulled from a roster of public or non and industry arbitrators who are presented to the parties, and they have they can strike names and kind of reduce the list to a panel that they're comfortable with. For larger disputes above 50,000, it's a 3-arbitrator panel, 3-person panel. For smaller disputes, we have a more kind of like a small claims process, which is for under 50,000, with more expedited procedures for smaller claimants to resolve their disputes through arbitration.
And now the customers can now elect to have 3 public arbitrators because you all changed your rules.
Either party could. Yeah.
But all right, some folks are critical of the effective mandate because almost every broker-dealer has it in their contract that there's arbitration. So that raises the question of, why is arbitration better than a normal court, or is it? And then there are a number of other things perhaps we could quickly go through. For example, the arbitrations are closed. They're not terminated. You can walk in a courtroom and see what's going on, but you can't walk in if you're a reporter or the public. You can't walk into a FINRA arbitration. And so the transparency issues arise there. And then while your rules are much more structured than, say, an American Arbitration Association arbitration, which basically are rule-free, but they're much less structured than a court. And one of the complaints that I've heard is that it's very difficult for those representing customers to in effect get discovery out of the broker dealers. So if you could sort of maybe touch on those 3 things.
Well, there clearly is an active debate about whether arbitration should be mandated. Traditionally, in the securities industry, the SEC has encouraged the SROs to maintain an arbitration forum because of the perception that it provides, in many cases, a cheaper, more effective way to resolve disputes than might be available to customers if they went to court. So it's the SEC has taken steps over the years to encourage that there be an SRO-run arbitration program, and we effectively are that program now for the other SROs by contract. And so the question of we do prohibit brokers from requiring customers to waive out of class actions. So a brokerage customer can participate in a class action. lawsuit, but they, if it's an individual claim, the broker's rule would, contract would require to be arbitrated. And as I mentioned before, the question of whether that's a good idea is with the SEC. I should footnote, I think one of the important things about maintaining a vibrant SRO model is that we recognize there are certain things that are best decided at the federal policy level, and I think this is one of them. This is an important enough issue that an SRO shouldn't be deciding it, the federal policymakers should be deciding it.
Let's change gears a little bit. Cybersecurity has been in the news. The SEC hacked, but virtually every government agency appears to have been hacked lately. I think I heard this morning the NSA has been hacked, and the IRS, OPM. Obviously, there's a lot of highly confidential, sensitive information held by FINRA members. So cybersecurity by broker-dealers is an important issue. What is FINRA doing in that area to help secure customer information? How do you balance the need for cybersecurity of customer database information with either not having outdated rules or having rules that are monumentally expensive? Could you just take a minute or two to discuss what you're doing there?
Sure. So we don't have a prescriptive cybersecurity rule. We do include reviews of cybersecurity in our examinations of broker-dealers because we think it is important. And what we are trying to do is to help firms identify areas where they could improve their cyber capabilities. Absolutely, it's incredibly important for the industry. And this is a
Do you have a special shop in FINRA that looks at
We
this?
do have a special group that has expertise in this area that as part of the examination function. This is an area where the industry and we're aligned, right? No one wants to have a cyber breach. The question that comes up is often like, well, why don't you have a cyber rule? And I think the challenge is that many of the entities we regulate are also regulated by other regulators, like the SEC or the CFTC or the banking regulators. And we are very focused on avoiding duplication or inconsistent rules. And so I think this is an area where, as regulators, it would be important to come together and to develop a more uniform approach to cybersecurity. And again, back to my mantra that SROs are really good at certain things, but there's certain other things that ought to be set at a federal policy level. I think we can be helpful here, but I think this really is, guidance on how to approach this issue in a consistent, uniform way would best come through federal coordination at the federal level. But it absolutely is an area that we're very focused on, and our member firms are focused on. And as I said, I think it's an issue we all care about.
In 2016, FINRA imposed something on the order of $175 million in fines. One of the criticisms of FINRA is how that money is used is sort of opaque and not fully disclosed or transparent. And then another criticism is that the money even stays with FINRA, but therefore provides an incentive for FINRA to impose fines because it helps contribute to your budget. Are you looking at making the use of that money more transparent? And what is your feeling about whether that fine money should be used for FINRA's budget or perhaps given to an investor reimbursement fund or some other, the Treasury, whatever? Fines.
The issue of fines, first of all, last year was our largest fine year ever, so it's a little bit of an outlier. But traditionally, FINRA has used fines to help support capital projects. So where do we get the money to help do like the Trace for Treasuries initiative that I mentioned, or to help do the cross-market surveillance activities that I talked about, where we're pulling in a lot of data and analyzing it to look for trading anomalies and like. We get that, we allocate fine money to that. And we're not the only SRO that collects fines, by the way.
Oh, sure.
There are other SROs do as well. And the SEC has looked at this issue from, I think at one point they even proposed a rule that would govern how fine money was used by different SROs. And it basically had the same if I recall correctly, had the same guiding principle that the fine money ought to be allocated to regulatory, support regulatory functions, or in our case, a capital initiative. That said, we are looking at this issue. We're in the process of preparing our budget for 2018, and as part of that, we're working with the board to think through what is the right approach to fines going forward. How can we provide more
If I remember
transparency?
correctly, Richard Sherman raised this in Jay Clayton's oversight hearing. Maybe.
It has been raised. People are interested in more transparency. So we're looking at how can we provide, well, first of all, what is our policy? Let's revisit our policy on fines and where do we want to go? Recognizing that while we feel confident that we are not going after fines just to hit a number or to achieve a revenue goal or something like that, we recognize that there's a perception issue. And so we want to talk with our board about what should be our approach going forward on fines. And I think you'll also see we're working on a number of aspects of the principles guiding our budget going forward, that after we set the budget in December, we would hope to be able to share more about what changes we're making there. It's part of the FINRA 360 initiative.
Okay. The Jobs Act created a new sort of regulatory category, a crowdfunding portal, which is regulated by FINRA. How many crowdfunding portals are there now, and what have you learned about them and what it's like to regulate crowdfunding portals as opposed to traditional broker-dealers? And are there changes that you think are appropriate?
Well, we have, so we post-Jobs Act, which set up the crowdfunding portal, and the SEC's rules on that, we had an obligation to set up and administer a registration and oversight regime. I think we have about 29 portals now. It's either 29. It's either 20 or 30. I don't remember the exact number, but it's a area that we think is important, and that it's a good example of how we could try collectively to create a tailored regime to a particular business model. And we've done that in other areas as well. And so it's something that we want to help support. I think there's to the extent that we have gotten some comment in our comment file. We opened up all our rules related to capital formation for comment. We said everything that touches on capital formation, if there's a FINRA rule or a FINRA process that you have a comment on, please comment on it so we could figure out what we can improve on. And we did get some comments on the crowdfunding portal. There's some concerns about the limit being too low. That's not something actually we can set, but that might be something to explore. And I've heard that some people are concerned about the process, and that's something for whether we've tailored our engagement with those types of firms appropriately to their business models. And that's something that's very open to having a conversation on and learning how we can help support it, because we do want to help support that model.
All right, I'll ask two more questions and we'll open it to the audience. One, more and more in government, we have introduced economists to the rulemaking process, and the idea of cost-benefit analysis and regulatory flexibility analysis and so on down the line. You have now established an Office of the Chief Economist, are starting the process of introducing economics and cost-benefit analysis to your rulemaking process. What have you learned so far? What do you anticipate happening along those lines? Is there a way for the public to become more engaged in that process? And
so yes, as you mentioned, we have established an Office of Chief Economist run by a great chief economist who's had experience in other regulators as well, including the SEC. And we've put forward a guiding set of principles of how we will use economic analysis in our rulemaking process. And I think it's a very interesting effort, because we're sort of trying to tailor economic analysis as it's applied in the federal context to the SRO context. So if you look at our guiding principles on economic analysis, you'll see more in there about engagement and with the stakeholders early on. Because one of the things we do is that when we have a rule going up to our board, we run it by a number of our advisory committees. So they actually see the rule text before it even gets voted on, and they can comment on it. That doesn't happen at a federal regulator, that the industry gets to see the rules and give their thoughts on them before they even get voted on by the board. And there's often, in my limited time at FINRA, I can assure you, there's often significant changes made or change in direction taken as a result of the comments that we get. So we have this process where a rule goes through a comment from the committees. It goes up to our board. They get the benefit of hearing what the industry comment was. Then it goes out for public comment. So anyone can comment on our rules. Then we take that comment into account, and our chief economist is very much involved. That's a stage where we're really trying to get data to help inform our economic analysis, supporting the rule and understanding what the potential consequences might be. And then it gets filed with the SEC, where it gets put out for comment again. Mm-hmm. And
although it's rarely changed at that point.
Yeah, I would disagree with you on that one, because there are times when, as a result of comment that comes in during that comment process at the SEC, that we have to refile it. And we have to respond to those comments at a minimum, but we often amend our filing as a result of comments that we receive. So there's at least 2 opportunities for the public to comment. And one of the things I'd mentioned about our chief economist office, which we are expanding, because I think it's a very important part of what we do, both in the rulemaking context and in informing our policy making and our understanding of the markets more generally. We're also ramping up our retrospective rule reviews. So this is take a look at an existing rule and look back on how it's working. And not just
always more of that we're done.
No. Not just the rule, but the processes we follow to implement the rule, which can be as important as what's on the written page itself. And to get public input on that and then revisit those rules.
There's a lot of lip service now to retrospective review, but in government it's very rarely done. So before we open it to the audience question, one sort of last open-ended question. What do you see as your priorities going forward? Is there any particular message you'd like to convey to the audience and our listeners?
Well, I think number one, FINRA 360 is going to be a high priority for me and for our organization going forward. We got a lot of support from the board. It's not going to be a quick process. We think this is a multi-year process, but we think it's a very healthy process for us to be going through. Number 2, we're going to stay sharp and vigilant on performing our regulatory obligations, and that includes particular focus on high-risk brokers or bad actors. And I think that aligns very well with some of what you're hearing from the SEC about their focus on retail issues. So that'll be very much part of our agenda going forward. And the third thing I'd mention is that this listening tour is ongoing. So we're open for business in terms of getting input from people who have ideas, thoughts. The best ideas in many cases come from the people we regulate or who deal with our regulations or who represent customers. So in that vein, David, I appreciate your interest in FINRA and your thoughts in your paper and otherwise. We want the input from any source, and we're going to look at it and say, can we be a better SRO to live up to the promise of the SRO model? And if so, we'll adopt them.
Okay. Audience questions. And if you could just say your name and institutional affiliation before you ask. Yes, ma'am.
Stan?
Doesn't matter, as long as we can hear.
Hi, I wrote some notes out, and I'll read them, and if you can address them. And it's a pleasure to meet you in person. We've corresponded by email.
Could you say your name and institutional affiliation?
Oh, gosh, I was hoping to save that for last. I'm Carrie Devra, and I'm Public Investor 12-03894. I'm the first ever investment client ever found in bad faith in an industry-only SRO. So my questions are, FINRA is a securities-only SRO. It's limited to securities, brokers, and brokerages. FINRA takes custody of complaints against investment advisors. Congress has not given FINRA oversight of investment advisors. And you heard investment clients complaints into your forum when your own website states investment client complaints and investment advisor issues are to go to the courts or to forums other than FINRA. And you state that investment clients must sign special agreements, submission agreements, when in fact you're having investment clients sign the broker's agreements. The reality is that there's a high-profile case now that I would love you to address separate from that. But broker check is not telling the investment clients the reality that you are a non-neutral forum because you are industry paid for. You're not listing on the broker check the denials, the expungements, the settlements, or cases that have aged off a broker's timeline.
Ma'am, could you
Also-
try to wrap it up and
Sure,
ask
just
your
one
question?
more point, which is very important. There are lawyers who are bringing investment clients into your forum across state lines when the lawyer is not licensed in the jurisdiction. So FINRA has been allowing lawyers to work in conflict with the resident bar associations. So I would appreciate if you would address those points. Thank you.
Well, just to give a little context, I think to some of what I heard, and I didn't make this point before, but it's an important one. FINRA only regulates the brokerage industry. We do not regulate investment advisors. And that can be confusing to people because those are two channels through which people get personalized
Although you've
investment advice.
explored it, and then that industry has resisted it.
In
I
the
mean,
past,
there's a whole, I was gonna get into that, but we don't have enough time, so.
Yeah. But FINRA doesn't regulate investment advisors. They're regulated by the states or by the SEC. And so I've been trying to make it clear whenever I can, although I neglected to do so earlier, that there are boundaries to what we regulate. You also mentioned broker check. Broker check's the platform that I referred to earlier, where you can go online and see not only whether your broker is or your advisor is registered either with FINRA or with a state agency, but also their disciplinary history. And there are lots of views on both sides about whether we put in enough information in broker check or whether there's information that's not in there that would be useful. It's a topic that that's one of the areas where our chief economist and his ability to conduct very thoughtful research has been helpful to us in informing. We have a special working group of our board looking at the issues around broker check and what kinds of information should be disclosed there. I think there are some other specific questions that are more detailed than I'm going to be able to address right now, although I'm sure we could find someone from FINRA to help and hear your comments more specifically on those issues.
Yes, sir.
I'm Mark Sheff with Investment News. First of all, this is an interesting moment in the feedback tour. You're sitting just a few feet away from one of FINRA's critics, and
Would that be you?
no, Mr. Burton, not just report. But Mr. Burton has written of FINRA, quote, "It is largely unaccountable to the industry or to the public. Due process, transparency, and regulatory review protections normally associated with regulators are not present, and its arbitration process is flawed. Reforms are necessary." You've spoken a couple of times today about taking matters to the board. You're going to discuss it with the board. But what is your gut feeling about whether FINRA 360 is really going to make fundamental changes like the ones that Mr. Burton outlined in this abstract?
Well, I do not know if I'll ever be able to make David a happy man, but
That's unhappy?
but in fairness to both of us, really, David's article, I think, identified a number of issues that he said FINRA should consider, and or that other policymakers should consider, and he also identified a number of paths forward, which included FINRA looking carefully at itself, and that's what we're trying to do. There are a number of things that I think that are ideas that are in the David's piece that I think are probably, in my mind, more challenging to think about adopting because, as I said before, I want to look at whether it's going to make us a better SRO, and so some things. There's this pendulum. Some people would have us look more like the government in some ways, and some people would have us want to be more responsive to the industry. And I think we need to find a careful middle ground and a balance. So I think we have to take a holistic view to that and make sure that we are trying to manage that tension appropriately. I do think that there's, one of the things I learned from the listening tour, I believe, is that there may be many ways to optimize. In other words, to find ways to help the industry comply and to reduce unnecessary burden without reducing investor protection. And I think there's a lot of good work that can be done along those lines, which I think will have the most meaningful impact to our members, while also helping us pursue the mission of protecting investors and promoting market integrity.
Linda, just one, wait for the mic.
I don't think I really need this mic. Following the beginnings of 360 and where you are in the listening tour, of the changes that have already been implemented as a result, what are the one or two things that you're most proud of?
Well, I'll give you two examples that I think are helpful. One is this combination of our enforcement program is a significant change for us, and it's not done yet. It's a lot of work needs to be conducted to integrate to organizational groups and not just change reporting lines, but make sure that we're looking at process flows and principles and the like. So I think that's a meaningful, significant change. It was something that was raised in the comments on our engagement notice, so it was something that was suggested to us, but frankly, it's something that our own folks had identified as an issue too. So we take this feedback we get through it, and we then look at it and decide, do we think that what's the problem? Are we diagnosing it the right way? And I think that was a healthy outcome of FINRA 360. I'll mention two other things. One is we've committed to providing by the end of this year a statement of exam findings. What do we see on exams? And so this should be coming out relatively soon, this quarter. And the idea behind it is that member firms have said, FINRA, you're conducting exams across different firms. What are you seeing so that we can get ahead of that issue? The reason I like that idea is because it ties back to one of the points I was making earlier about why have an SRO. There's an ability to help firms see what we're seeing and give them tools to better comply with the rules to get ahead of the issue. And one other thing I'll mention is that something we've done internally at FINRA is to solicit input from our employees about how they can do a better job. And we collectively can. We've got some great ideas from our employees that we are in the process of implementing. Some of them will revolve around training, some revolve around the tools that they have. But again, a lot of opportunity to take a fresh look at what we do. And I think that willingness to look externally, hear what people are saying externally, and hear what our own people are saying is probably the part of FINRA 360 I'm most excited about.
Georgia.
Hi, Georgia Quinn, I disclose. Thank you, first of all, for coming, Mr. Cook. We really appreciate this. When we started this discussion today, you noted that 90% of your member firms are what you consider small firms. And when you look at the board requirements and the board makeup of the 7 seats that are dedicated to member institutions, 3 of them are dedicated to small firms, which are defined as 150 or less employees. So that really doesn't seem that small to me, considering the makeup of your membership. 1 is designated for a medium-sized firm, and 3 are designated for large firms, which are 500 or more. So I just was wondering if you could kind of go through the rationale behind that, and if you think there might be an opportunity to redistribute those seats and representation.
So the rationale for allocating the membership on the representation on our board that way is that we want to have a fair representation of our members on the board, and the details of how this particular structure emerged are kind of buried in the history of NASD and where we came from. I will note one thing, which is that the structure we have, and including the board makeup, was voted on by the members in connection with the merger. So there's some element of democratic principle in terms of how we got to the governance structure that we have. That said, I've been interested in how we can make sure that the views of the small firms, and we have some great small firm governors, they're all great, and we have the small firm advisory board that I mentioned earlier. And that is another, that's one of the committees that every rule that we, that goes up to the board has to go through that committee to make sure we hear their views. And I think it's part of the 360 process and looking at our committees. One of the areas that is of interest to me is figure out how do we make sure and enhance the voice of that membership. Changing the structure of our board actually requires a vote of our members, and that's a much more difficult process to go through. But there's lower hanging fruit that we might be able to pursue to make sure that we're hearing the voice and the different voices in the small firm membership, because they're not all the same. And one of the things that we've done is as part of FINRA 360 is to launch something we call an innovation outreach initiative. And I mention it because of the point that many of our smaller firms are technology innovators, and we want to make sure we're engaging with them and hearing from them about where our rules may be getting in the
Is
way.
there a particular staff person that's leading that effort?
Yeah, we have a whole, we have an office.
Who is that, if you don't mind? Because there's probably people that would want to.
It's the Office of Emerging Regulatory Issues, and there's a fellow named Jaime Workey, but there are others. It's a group. They are doing a series of roundtables. They are one in San Francisco, one in Dallas, one in New York, to meet with technology-oriented members about what they're doing. And also, we're setting up a new advisory committee it's going to have its first meeting later this month to help us understand better we want to make sure we understand what are technology developments that are happening, where are rules maybe getting in the way, and what risks are there being created for investors that we all care about. But I mention it in the small firm context because it's just an example of how we have what I mentioned before, heterogeneity in our small firm makeup that we want to make sure we're being sensitive to.
All right, one or two additional questions? Yes, sir.
Dave Belair with FSI. And my question is, another issue that's getting a lot of attention here recently is unpaid arbitration claims. And I was wondering if FINRA has analyzed and quantified the size of that problem, and whether you've considered things like using fine revenue to cover those unpaid claims.
So we've been taking a broad look at the issue of unpaid claims, trying to understand what causes them and what we can do about them. This is an area of interest to other regulators as well. So the states have been taking a look at this issue, and we want to make sure we're coordinating with them. Our board has recently approved putting out for comment some changes that are meant to give FINRA more tools to deal with issues where someone might be trying to avoid a claim by moving to, or reorganizing or selling their assets or something like that. We already have some tools there, and we're very vigilant about trying to address those situations, but we think there's more we can do there. But there's a range of other issues, some of which other approaches that we can consider. And so we want to pursue a dialogue around this issue, particularly with the SEC going forward. And one of the comments that we got on the engagement notice was a request for more information about unpaid arbitration awards, how much, how many in terms of dollars, numbers. And so that's something we're looking at trying to put out more information on in a relatively near future.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Jenny Grimberg with the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm just wondering, what is your stance, if any, on the CFPB's ban on mandatory arbitration clauses?
No stance. I mentioned before that I think we try to run a fair, efficient arbitration program, implementing what we understand to have been a policy direction at the federal level for some time. But the decision about whether there should be a ban or not, I think, is one that is in the hands of the SEC, and as I mentioned before, appropriately so, given that it's a significant policy issue and we shouldn't be using SROs to resolve policy issues that ought to be resolved at the federal level.
Well, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, David. Appreciate it very much. Thank you, everybody.
This concludes our event.